In the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. God, our Heavenly Father, we give thanks for this time together. We give thanks for gathering all of us here to give glory to you and to sing of your mercies, dear Lord, especially in the lives of Therese, of Saint Therese, and also of Dorothy Day. And we humbly ask you, O Lord, that you will bless each and every one of us with your wisdom and with your guidance, and help us, O Lord, to inspire us so that we can, through the example of Saint Therese, give glory to you and make our lives truly an offering to your goodness. We make this prayer through Christ our Lord. Amen. Holy Spirit. Amen. So, very good evening to everybody, brothers and sisters. It's an honor, it's a privilege again to be with all of you and to share a little bit about Saint Therese. As most of you will know that her feast day is very near. It's on the 1st of October, this Saturday. So I think it's only right that we also, to deepen our understanding, deepen our relationship with Therese, it's good to at least have a session just to explore a little bit more about our dear saint here. Much has been said about her, no doubt, but at least for me personally, it's always something new to discover about our Saint Therese. No doubt, sometimes we can say that she's a very down-to-earth, a very humble saint, but in that humility and in that simplicity, there is a lot to discover about her. And I find that of all our Carmelite saints, perhaps she is one of the most approachable ones. Very down-to-earth, sometimes can be very practical even. And in a way, she simplifies a lot about what we understand by our Carmelite spirituality. Sometimes it can be very theoretical, sometimes it can be quite difficult to understand, but through the life of Therese, I think she makes it livable, she makes it easier to grasp. And so I hope that our session today can help us to appreciate that aspect of Therese. So I will just going to share a screen. Okay, it says here, host disabled participant screen sharing. Can I just ask for the ability to share the screen?
Can you share now, Father?
Okay. Still no, not yet. Still okay. Cannot.
Can I just make you host?
Okay.
Okay.
Okay. I am the host. Okay. All right. Can you see this?
Yes, Father.
So my talk today is going to be titled "The Revolutionary and the Little Flower." And it is essentially a discussion on the influence of Therese of Lisieux on Dorothy Day. And I'm not sure how many of you actually know who Dorothy Day actually is, or at least have heard something about Dorothy Day.
Don't know her.
Don't know, not at all. Nothing, nada.
Nada.
Oh dear.
Okay.
American saint. An American saint. Yes, she's American. Is she canonized? I think not yet. But definitely someone who is very prominent, especially in the American Catholic Church. So, of course, part of this talk, we will explore a little bit about Dorothy Day as well. And maybe by knowing her today, it might just inspire some to just dig a little bit deeper and to know her. She is quite an interesting person to encounter as well. And remember, I was mentioning in the beginning of this talk, in the introduction, that there is a lot about Therese to discover. And this connection between Therese and Dorothy Day is one of the pleasant surprises that I have had the opportunity to come across. So, right, let's get on to that. So first and foremost, let's just try to situate ourselves to the context of this talk today. And the question we can actually ask is, what does it mean to be Catholic today? So of course, to be a Catholic, simple answer, we can say, it means proclaim the good news, share the love of Jesus so that others may share in it. That is our mission that we have been entrusted to. And it's, of course, one of the commission that Jesus gives to his apostles, and from them given also to us. That is at Matthew chapter 28, verse 20, go forth, make disciples of all nations and all that. So we are, of course, called to do that. And that is obviously one aspect of our vocation. And in order to fulfill that vocation, of course, requires spiritual strength, requires people of deep spirituality. spirituality here in the sense that we are asked to be people who are close to the Lord. So just as the disciples, the apostles, they were people who were chosen by the Lord to have this intimate encounter with Him. And it is through that encounter that their lives were changed, their lives were transformed. And from there, they then brought the good news also to those around them. And so spirituality for us, prayer, sacraments, adoration, so on and so forth, all of these things are means by which we come to draw ever closer to the Lord. But it is not just a spiritual aspect to be Catholic, it is also active, because we have also an active aspect to our vocation. You know, we are not just praying only in homes. We also have ministries. We also have to have awareness for those who are disadvantaged, those who are marginalized. We are called to be peacemakers, you know, as the Beatitudes say, blessed are the peacemakers. So all of these things also come into play when it comes to to answer that question, what does it mean to be Catholic today? And as I'm speaking about these, I'm just bringing forth some aspects of what it means to be a Catholic today. Sometimes perhaps there are certain emphases which can become lopsided. Sometimes one can become overly spiritual, perhaps. Sometimes somebody can be overly active and not dedicating enough time to prayer, and vice versa. Sometimes just prayer, but not enough maybe activity, not enough ministering to the outside, witnessing to the outside. Sometimes this has been criticisms labeled against certain Catholics. And sometimes there is also tension between these two poles. One is the activity, and the other one is the spiritual aspect. That is the just give me yes. So no. So that there's these two polarities that exist between the spiritual aspect and the active, the ministry aspect. And we can in fact speak about this as terms of Martha and Mary. This famous dichotomy, apparent dichotomy that exists between these two personalities that we find in the gospel. So of course we know what the gospel actually, how does it go? Martha and Mary being sisters, the sisters of Lazarus, and Jesus actually visits the house. And what do we find? We find Martha, who is busy trying to arrange things, trying to get food, trying to serve Jesus. And on the other hand, you have Mary, who is sitting just at the feet of Jesus, listening to him. And Martha, therefore, becomes very frustrated with this situation. She actually speaks to Jesus in a way, almost rebuking him. Can't you tell, Jesus, can't you tell my sister to, get off her backside and actually help me? That frustration just boiling over. So people have often spoken about here as in this apparent conflict, as to say that the contemplative is superior to the active, and in fact, some of our Carmelites, maybe we might have that sort of idea to say that, we are better because we are focusing more on contemplation, and we, those who are active, and there's no place for the active apostolate. We are contemplatives because this is our particular call. But I think, it's important to note that sometimes that sort of dichotomy, this distinction between Martha and Mary is quite artificial. It is not the role of the gospel to put one superior to the other. Both must coexist. Just that in this particular episode, why does Jesus say that Mary has the better part? It is because Mary put herself in a position to listen, to absorb, to be prayerful. In no way does Jesus say that service is not good or service is bad, but there is a time for everything. There is a time to listen to the Lord, and there is a time to actually go out and to serve our brothers and sisters. So this is also the dynamic that we find in our Carmelite life. In fact, we may be called to contemplation, we may be called to spend intimate time with the Lord, we are called to union with him, but it never just remains like that, just like me and Jesus, just like a private or exclusive relationship. Because once we have been filled with the Lord, we are then called to go out and to bring him to others. And therefore, it is only right that our Holy Mother, Saint Therese, she would say that Martha and Mary must work together. And in fact, she says these words at the very end of the interior castle, which means that when a person has advanced tremendously in one's life of prayer, what leads from that is service, good works. So Martha and Mary must walk together. So as we are saying all of these things, just to summarize, so Martha represents busyness, activity, the hecticness, the chaos. Mary, she represents silence, contemplation, and prayer. And of course, the words of Jesus, Mary has chosen the better part, and that will not be taken from her. So of course, he does not ask us to choose. Rather, it is both must actually coexist together. Both must walk together. And in fact, they must coexist, as Saint Therese herself would actually acknowledge in the Interior Castle. Now, you all might be asking, I thought the talk is on Saint Therese. Where is Therese entering here? So we are going to see actually two figures here. And in the beginning of the talk, we talk about Therese and Dorothy Day. And both figures could actually, in my opinion, they seem to personify Martha and Mary. And we'll see how well they actually, or how did they both actually coexist, or how did both actually interact with one another. So we're going to look at Dorothy Day. We're going to get to know our Martha for today's talk. And so if you can look at the years by which she lived, 1897 to 1980. So she was born actually at a time when Therese was, I think she was still alive at that time, 1897, if I'm not wrong. But I think she was probably at the end of her life, end of Therese's life. But she lived a good part of the 20th century. So she would have witnessed a lot of upheaval in the world. Definitely she lived through 2 world wars. And more than that, of course, she would have been around during the times of Vatican II. She would have seen the changes that were taking place even within the Catholic Church itself. And in fact, Dorothy Day's life is what we can consider a life of great dynamism, a lot of things going on in her life. So what was she? She was a journalist, she was a social activist, she was an anarchist. So this is a word which oftentimes we might be a bit alarmed. Anarchist is someone who brings anarchy into the situation. But of course, from Dorothy Day's perspective, the civil disobedience, you think about someone who is involved in perhaps launching a certain demonstration, perhaps for a certain cause. Think about someone like Martin Luther King, who would be someone along that line. He would, for the sake of civil rights, for equality amongst the blacks and other segments of society, he actually would organize rallies and marches across the United States to bring awareness, to actually make their voices heard, to say that the situation as it is unbearable. So Dorothy Day was also someone like that. She was someone who was very politically involved in many causes. And she was someone who really was very much, think about someone who would organize our birthday rallies in Malaysia. So Dorothy Day would be someone who organized this in her day. But what sort of experience, what sort of issues was she interested in? So we will go a bit deeper. And so as a young person, she was someone who lived a bohemian lifestyle. A bohemian lifestyle, I would, just to simplify it, I think it is someone who lives somewhat of a hippie kind of like very free, even with regards to relationships, even with regards to morality, very loose. That's the best term I can think of, someone who was very much living a hippie lifestyle before the hippies became fashionable in the 60s. So as a young person, this would have been the 1920s. This was the type of lifestyle that she was involved in. And she was, of course, very much involved in radical movements at her youth. And she was actually a Christian at the point of birth. Family, I think they were not practicing Christians. I believe that they were not practicing Christians. But when she was a child, she was very much drawn to the evangelical Christian movements of her day. And when she was young, this was before she entered university, she experienced a lot of fervor to become, someone who was, as an evangelical Christian. However, as she grew older, as she matured and she entered into university and went for her tertiary education and all that, she fell away from the faith in Christianity and she became an atheist. And in fact, she became a communist. So this was the time before the Second World War, at a time when communism was still a movement that existed in American society. It was just one movement amongst many. And partly she felt that the wealthy classes were actually oppressing those who were the worker classes. And she was very much caught up by this philosophy, and she considered herself as someone who was a communist. So, but all of these things, however, changed at the point when she became a mother. So this was in the 1920s, after her days in university. As we can see from her lifestyle so far, she was a free spirit. In terms of morality, it was also very loose, no rules, nothing to do with the conservative values of her day. So she was involved in several men as well. And with one of these men, who was not her husband, she got pregnant. And at the point when she became a mother, something changed in her, and perhaps becoming a mother perhaps caused her to look at things a little bit more spiritually. And eventually, over the course of a pregnancy, she began to explore Christianity more, and she began to be drawn closer and closer towards Catholicism. Okay, so it was at this time where eventually she started to, her interest in Catholicism grew to the point where eventually she even became, she was baptized. And in fact, at the birth of her daughter in 1925, she gave the name Tamar Teresa to her daughter. Tamar is actually a Hebrew name, so probably a name that she found from the Bible. It was probably a name that, as she grew closer to Christianity and Catholicism, she began to read the Bible more. And Teresa here is actually Saint Teresa of Avila. So she also began to read the lives of the saints, and Saint Teresa had a particular impression upon her. And so she really admired Saint Teresa. She found her very dynamic, so much so that she actually gave that name to her daughter as well, Tamar Teresa. So what did she do? What happened after that? And so, of course, in spite of a conversion to Catholicism and all that, it did not dampen her spirit for fighting for social justice. It did not diminish her passion to promote the rights of the poor. And so in 1933, Dorothy Day, together with another journalist by the name of Peter Morin, they founded this newspaper called the Catholic Worker Movement. And it was actually a newspaper that was targeted towards workers. And it was a way in which these two persons, Dorothy Day and Peter Morin, they wanted to help the poor and the homeless in New York City. And so it was a means by which to raise awareness to the social problems of the day. And also, on top of the Catholic Worker Movement, on top of the newspaper that they published, they also opened a shelter or a hospitality house, which was a place to serve food on the Lower East Side of Manhattan. So this is in New York, actually. And if, for some of you who know your history well, in 1933 was a time where the world was experiencing the Great Depression. So whereby there was a huge economic collapse around the world, and many people were actually unemployed. Many people lost their homes, many people lost their savings because banks actually folded, and even till today, this event, the Great Depression, is still something that people in economics would actually study. And it's always, whenever there's a threat of global recession and stock market collapse and all that, they often point back to this event of the Great Depression because it was very shocking at the time. Many people lost everything. And so that caused many workers in 1933, they were actually forced to live in slums, actually. So one interesting thing about New York, I'm sure some of you would have heard of this huge park in the middle of Manhattan called Central Park. Today is this green area where New Yorkers would go there. They would have some to jog. They would go for picnics and just have some quiet time to relax and unwind. But imagine in 1933, this entire park was something that looked like a slum from Calcutta or or even from Manila, or even some of our slums here in Malaysia. It was a shanty town because people who had lost their jobs, having lost their homes, had nowhere else to go. And the only place they could go to was to Central Park and to just put up a shanty town there, And these were the people that Dorothy Day was trying to approach and trying to help, actually, and trying to defend their rights. So she founded. Sorry, just give me a minute. I clicked too many times. So where were we? Yeah, so therefore, Catholic Worker. So this was to draw attention to social injustice and promote Catholic social teaching. So of course, by this time, Dorothy Day would have been a Catholic for almost 10 years. And also at this time, of course, the Catholic social doctrine was also in its process of development. Already, in fact, if we remember Dorothy Day being born in 1897, it was also around that time that the first social encyclical actually came out from Pope Leo the Great. Pope Leo X, called Rerum Novarum, which was promoting about, it was the first social encyclical that spoke about the rights of property, the rights of workers, equal rights to be given to people who are working, etc., etc. So this was also something that Dorothy Day was also very much in the know. She was someone who was already into understanding and awareness about the Catholic social doctrine. And this was the means by which she would actually go out and promote and actually to raise awareness. It was through this newspaper that was called the Catholic Worker Movement. So on top of a shelter that she and Peter Morin were running, they were also spreading the word out through this newspaper. So you can see she was someone who was extremely busy, very active, a lot of things going on, as you can imagine. And in fact, this worker movement is still in existence even till today. So in fact, there are more than 100 of such houses functioning in the United States today. Whether there are any other houses outside the United States, that one I can't be sure. But nevertheless, we can see that because of what she did and the movement that she actually formed, it had a tremendous impact upon society. So of course, over time, the Great Depression eventually ended. Then there was the Second World War, and the economy eventually, of course, experienced a period of revival. But that did not stop the Catholic worker movement in terms of standing up for social justice. And so it would actually take a stand on various other issues. So of course, we mentioned just now Martin Luther King and speak about civil rights movement and of the end of of the prejudices that existed between the whites and the blacks, and even today we talk about also the other segments of American society. You have the Latinos, you have the Asians there, but nevertheless, the Catholic worker movement was at the forefront of ending this entire situation against racial segregation. And of course, to also remember that as we move on into the 60s, or rather even the post-war period, the 50s, you begin to see there was the nuclear arms race between the Soviets and the Americans. And the threat of nuclear warfare was very, very strong in the 50s and the 60s. And Dorothy Day, also through the Catholic worker movement, would actually protest the testing and the development of nuclear weapons, and how it was such a great danger to society, to humanity, in fact. Also, we speak about the Vietnam War. So today in the Ukraine, we have heard stories about ordinary Russians now being mobilized because their armies are not doing so well in the Ukraine. Their soldiers have experienced defeat in the conflict, and so they need more soldiers. So now they are forcibly calling young men up in order to join the Russian army. So this was the situation that took place also during the Vietnam War. Some of you may remember that period. There was the draft, whereby they were announced over television persons of certain persons that would be forced to enter the US Army and be sent to fight in Vietnam. And of course, for a person like Dorothy Day, one thing, she was very opposed to war. She was very convinced that it was a very destructive, obviously a very destructive thing for humanity to undergo, and even more so with the forms of conflict, the forms by which warfare is fought, becoming more and more destructive. So she would, of course, oppose even any involvement or even unwilling sending of people to fight in a conflict far, far away. And true to Catholic teaching as well, we see her as well being very involved in protecting life even from the womb, so the opposition towards abortion and birth control. So in fact, saying that, we would show how she actually had experienced a period of conversion and how she became more Catholic in terms of her way of thinking from the time when she first encountered Catholicism. We can see someone who, as a youth, embraced a very bohemian lifestyle where things like abortion and birth control would not have been an issue at all. But you see her now very much as someone who speaks for Catholic doctrine, for Catholic social teaching, and even for things which concerns the Catholic social teaching are matters by which she's actually marching for. She's actually trying to raise awareness for. And just to look at that picture there that we see accompanying the notes, we see her there actually marching for racial equality. All men are brothers. So she is there actually protesting against segregation. She's protesting against war, and very much employing non-violence. Just trying to raise awareness through the actions that she was doing. Okay, everything okay so far? Right, okay, good. So we're going to just take a couple of steps back because we've just seen a little bit of who Dorothy Day actually was. And now we're going to speak about her encounter with Therese. So I think from what we've described so far, Dorothy Day is a true Martha. She's very busy. She's, you can see, I think her days would have been filled with all kinds of activities. She has to publish a newspaper. She's probably meeting with other activists. She's probably trying to keep abreast with developments that are taking place in the world, etc., etc. Days are just full. You can imagine that hectic chaos that she was probably living in. And how does she encounter then the Mary of our presentation today? And this is actually, of course, Therese, since we are talking about Therese here. And we're going to take a few steps back to the point where she had just given birth to her daughter, Tamar Teresa. And so she's convalescing in the hospital. She's recovering from the delivery. And the name Teresa there is actually named after Teresa of Avila. So in this hospital, she actually encounters a Catholic nurse. And upon hearing that she had named the child Tamar Teresa, the nurse became very excited. She said, "Oh, that's a beautiful name you've given your daughter." And so she, in her excitement and also probably in her joy of meeting a fellow Catholic, she gives to Dorothy Day a medal that belongs to her. This nurse, she gives this medal to her, to Dorothy Day. But it is not a medal of Teresa of Avila. In fact, when she would ask this nurse, "Do you have a medal of Teresa of Avila?" the nurse would say, Who is this Teresa of Avila? I do not know her. But she said the Teresa that she knows is Therese of Lisieux. And of course, the Therese is French for Teresa. Teresa is the Spanish version of that. So for many an English-speaking world, in fact, there is constantly this confusion perhaps that exists between Teresa and Therese. Especially here in West Malaysia, we have many churches which are named after Saint Teresa. One is very near to Seremban in Nilai, and there is another one in Malacca, also Saint Teresa. Both have nothing to do with Teresa of Avila. Both are in fact named after Therese of Lisieux. And so, like this nurse here, she was a devotee of Saint Therese. She had heard about Saint Therese. She loved the story of Saint Therese, and she had a medal of Saint Therese. And so, out of her gesture of kindness, she actually gives this medal to Dorothy Day to be given to her baby girl. It's like, this may Saint Teresa protect you. So, but of course, Dorothy Day was a bit, like, who is this other saint, Saint Teresa? So, but she didn't think much about that. And what happens next? These things are moving. All right. So in 1928, of course, Dorothy Day begins to actually, she also has a spiritual director by the name of Father Zachary, and she is actually an Augustinian father. And over time, he begins to think that, what's going on? Who is Hilda Heng? Okay, I don't know. Are you all seeing these blue scratches there? Yeah. Anyway, just ignore them. Just ignore them. Okay. Yeah. So anyway, what happens? Yeah. So Father Zachary, in fact, in terms of the spiritual direction sessions that he's giving to Dorothy Day, he actually recommends to Dorothy Day to read The Story of a Soul. And The Story of a Soul is, of course, the autobiography of Saint Therese, her spiritual biography. And in fact, the impression that Dorothy Day has of Therese is not very flattering. In fact, she found it very, very simple. And we have to understand, of course, Dorothy Day, with the type of temperament that she had, she would have seen, in terms of saints, people who were very courageous, people who were very, how would I put it? People who were very dynamic, people who did things, basically. So if you ask Dorothy Day in 1928, how would you describe a Catholic saint? She would think about someone like maybe St. John of Arc, for example. She would think about probably one of the martyrs of Rome, people who basically gave their lives in a very, very striking manner to bear witness to the Lord. And so when she read The Story of a Soul, she found a saint who was the antithesis of all those characteristics, because Therese was someone who was very, very hidden. She was someone who was very humble. It seems like she did not do anything much. And so Dorothy Day, in fact, when she read this book in 1928, The Story of a Soul, she actually said these words: "I found it colorless, I found it monotonous, too small, in fact, for my notice. What kind of saint was this who felt that she had to practice heroic charity in eating what was put in front of her, in taking medicine, in enduring cold and heat, restraint, enduring the society of mediocre souls, in following the strict regime of the convent of Carmelite nuns? I was reading in my daily missal of saints stretched on the rack, burned by flames, starving themselves in the desert, and so on. So here you see that that contrast between Dorothy's idea of what constitutes sainthood and this person that is presented to her, or Therese of Lisieux. Therese of Lisieux seems like a little child, and she's talking about patience in terms of dealing with people who were difficult, in terms of even the kind of the hardships that she had to endure in the convent, even though it was hard for Therese, but for Dorothy Day, in reading the stories of people who were starving in the desert, people who had given up everything to the poor and were living in a cave or something like that, it was a total different thing altogether. So she was not even impressed at all, actually. Okay. All right. Okay, just give me a minute because I was trying to admit some people in. Okay, so let's continue on. Just give me a minute. Okay. All right. So, of course, as we can see that the impressions that Dorothy Day had of Therese was not that flattering. But of course, over time, she would come to re-evaluate her own ideas about Therese. And of course, we're going to see how that actually happened or how that actually take place. So, of course, it was also through her experience in working with the Catholic worker movement. All right. So I don't know. I'm just going to take a moment here. I'm going to stop sharing. Okay. I hope you don't mind because all these scratches that we find there is a bit distracting. I'm going to reshare again. Okay. So please bear with me. Yeah. So we're going to look a bit into, of course, Therese, our Mary, with regard to, compared to Dorothy Day's Martha. So who was Therese Martin? And even from the very family background of Therese itself, we can already see the great differences that existed between Therese and Dorothy. So when you speak about Therese, she was someone who was born and raised in a very devout and working class family. Probably working class. Both Dorothy Day and Therese would have shared that background. But for Therese, especially for her family, it was a family which was perhaps a bit better off than working class. They were quite bourgeois, if you want to call it that way. And Therese was also the youngest. She was the baby of the family. And alongside her, there were four other siblings, four other sisters who survived infancy. And all of these sisters, in fact, would enter into religious life. So you can see already that whilst Dorothy Day grew up in a family which was only Christian in name, they were not practicing Christians. But for Therese, especially the Martin family, they were very devout Catholics. And faith, religion, prayer, all of these things formed very much a key component of family life. And of course, when we look at their family now in hindsight, we see how all five surviving daughters actually entered entered religious life. Four of them, of course, four sisters of Therese would enter into the Carmelite monastery, and together with her, they would be in the monastery of Lisieux. And then, of course, Leonie would be a Visitandine nun. But nevertheless, all five daughters, actually, all siblings, were actually in the Carmelite monastery. I mean, they were in religious life. And on top of that, the parents of Therese, Louise and Zélie, have also been canonized because there's been an appreciation recently for their deep life of holiness that they had, and also the example that they present in terms of parents and how they transmit the faith to their children, and even their very lives themselves bear testimony to their own deep faith as well. So they were saints, and in fact, Therese herself would say that her parents were saints. Even the other sisters would say our parents were very saintly people. They were full of love for God, and that love of God basically was transmitted to the daughters as well. So compared to, of course, the life of Dorothy Day, the life seems to have been, all very very interesting, very colorful. But Therese, on the other hand, was someone who was very sheltered, even to the point where some would use the terms mollycoddled. She was really, really protected. And in fact, she had very little experience of the world. I think the only time where she actually traveled out of Lisieux, the Lisieux was the town where she grew up in, was in a pilgrimage to Rome, in fact, to see the Holy Father, Pope Leo X, Leo the 13th, to meet Pope Leo the 13th, in order to ask his permission for her to enter the Carmelite convent of Lisieux, because she was too young at the time. She was only 15 years old. And that was the only time she actually left Lisieux to go to visit another place. So otherwise, she hardly left her home, in fact. And even her schooling as well, other than a few episodes whereby she actually attended a boarding school, but most of the time she was actually homeschooled. And that was also because she had a very sensitive temperament, and she found it difficult to adjust to life in the school itself. So very different also from Dorothy Day, who was someone who had attended university and of course was more perhaps, what was the term used? More worldly, I would say, for want of a better word. And even the life in Carmel, of course, after she entered the Carmelite monastery at the age of 15, of course, it's also a life which is very much cloistered. It is very, it's a world apart. It's a world of its own, basically. And it was a monastery that consisted of around 20 nuns living in a cloistered community. You can see that picture there. That is a group picture of the monastery of Lisieux. See if you can spot Therese somewhere there. I'm sure some of you can. Oh, she's just there. And it was a life which was very, very regimented, very, very structured, which is centered around prayer. And of course, the Eucharist is one of the key moments of their religious life. But of course, they also pray the divine office as well. So they actually recite all the hours. And those days, they would have recited everything in Latin. There would have been time, of course, for them to also cultivate their own personal prayer, spiritual reading. But outside of these times of prayer, Therese would have been involved in the various community works that needed to be done around such a big monastery. So obviously you can imagine with 20 nuns, to clean the monastery is one thing. Even there was a garden perhaps with even plants to take care of. You had some nuns who were elderly, so she would have to take care of them. And then I think she was also a sacristan. She had to prepare the chapel for the celebration of Mass. She was involved in that. And besides that as well, I think she was also an assistant novice. She was the assistant to the novice mistress, which means that she was also involved in forming nuns who were coming into the monastery. She was assisting the formator, the mistress herself, the novice mistress, to train these nuns. What does it mean to pray? What does it mean to be a Carmelite? How does it mean to live together? So she was of course busy, but busy in a different form of way. On top of that, also you have the life of Carmel is also marked by a form of asceticism. This form of asceticism, of course, doesn't exist anymore today. They are not so strict. But in those days, some of the nuns, they would even put on, they would wear an iron cross, for example, a cross which is intentionally uncomfortable. Even the clothes that they wear is of rough cloth. So it is not comfortable, in fact. And all of these things was done intentionally because the inconvenience, the discomfort that the nun suffers is then offered up as a sacrifice to God. So this was the spirituality that was lived in the Carmelite monastery at that time. And on top of that as well, you have other restrictions. There is no central heating. So in fact, the Carmel of Lisieux in those days was, during winter time, it was very cold. And it would have, the nuns would have to wake up in the morning and, if they wanted to wash their face, sometimes the water would have been ice. They would have needed to break through the ice, with their bare hands in order to wash their face, sorry. And then, of course, the food that they eat is as frugal as possible. So some of the sacrifices that the nuns were expected to undergo. And on top of that, you also have the unforeseen challenges, because you're living in a community of 20 nuns. And each nun would have her own personality, her own quirkiness, her own eccentricities. And sometimes when you're living in close contact, it can be quite jarring, it can be quite challenging. You cannot like everybody. And Therese herself would experience that there were certain nuns that she couldn't actually stand. She would feel like, oh, very hard to live with this person. But nevertheless, she tried her best to be as charitable as possible to all these nuns, And in fact, she was very charitable. It was a sacrifice that she took on her part. And even sometimes there were nuns who other members of the community could not really get along with. So during times when they would come together and sit together, sometimes some of these nuns, inevitably, they get isolated somewhat. But when Therese sees this thing happening, she would take a special effort to actually sit next to these nuns and to make sure that they were not left alone. And she was also known to be someone who was really, really funny. She could impersonate nuns. She could impersonate the priests who came to give talks there just to entertain the nuns, you know. And she was such a presence in the community. So, of course, some of the roles that Therese had in the Carmel, of course, she was sacristan. She was also the infirmarian. She was someone who took care of the sick nuns, gardening, and then helping elderly nuns to get around the monastery. I think there was one particular episode where she narrates she actually had to bring a nun who could not walk any longer. So she was seated on a wheelchair. So she had to accompany this nun from her cell, from her room, to the makan area, actually. So this was a job that nobody wanted. None of the nuns wanted, because that old nun was very grumpy. She was very unpleasant to be with. And so everybody tried to avoid this nun. But Therese, she actually took this nun under her wing, and she would actually bear with all the grumbling and all the all the unkind words that this elderly nun would actually say. You're good for nothing, you don't know how to push, things like that. But in all things, she actually tried to be as kind as possible. She would always smile at the nun, no matter what. Every time she would have to bring this nun to the refectory, she would just smile and exercise great patience to actually see the job through. Okay, so what is her spirituality? That we spoke about her life in the Carmel, but there is something about Therese, and in terms of her spirituality, that eventually became very interesting and very striking to all those who met her. So first and foremost, the life of a contemplative nun in Carmel is really a life of closeness to God. And there is always a lot of opportunities for the nuns to actually grow, to mature spiritually. And there are many ways by which that can happen. So we've already spoken about the life of prayer, you talk about the sacraments, you talk about spiritual reading, so on and so forth. And in fact, it is very much an integral part of the Carmelite life. So in the rule, the rule of Carmel, which is the rule that governs our day-to-day life, it is actually stated here that one is to meditate day and night on the law of the Lord. And the law of the Lord here, of course, it refers to Holy Scripture itself. So unless the nun is occupied with some other thing, it could be, she needs to clean the monastery, or she needs to tend to something in the garden, or she needs to work in the chapel, or she needs to see to some elderly nun. Outside of these times, when she has some free time, when she goes back to her room, she is not there to be idle. She's not there to lepak. It is a time for her to basically reconnect back with the Lord through the reading of scriptures. So the scriptures, in fact, was central to the life of the Carmelite. And indeed, the scriptures was central to the life of Therese herself. Okay. And of course, besides the scriptures, you have the writings of the Carmelite saints. So you have the likes of Saint Therese of Avila, this one who was Saint Therese of Avila, who was very dear to Dorothy Day, and also, of course, Saint John of the Cross as well. So besides these saints, of course, you would have other works that were written by other Carmelite authors, and they would have been reading all of these works, either reading them personally during their time, their private time, or even sometimes as they are taking their meals. This is a practice as well. The meals are usually taken in silence, but one nun will basically be reading something to accompany the meal itself. So usually they would take a reading from the saints, so that the whole community is essentially reading the saints together. Now, Therese herself, even before she entered the Carmel, she was already an avid reader of devotional books, of spiritual books. And the one book that she was particularly fond of was actually The Imitation of Christ. And this book was so influential for Therese, and she liked it so much that she committed to memory lots of the portions of the book. So it could be even that, whenever there were gatherings together of either the nuns or even before that amongst the family members, they just needed to say, Therese, what does it say in The Imitation of Christ in this page 20, for example? And she could actually just recite it by heart. Such was how much she enjoyed The Imitation of Christ. And of course, life of prayer, that one we mentioned before, the Eucharist, the Divine Office. And then, of course, the spiritual reading, that was what we mentioned just now. So all of these things, there were many components that Therese could have used in order to develop a certain spirituality of her own. Okay, just give me a few minutes. I'm just going to take a glass of water. So definitely from her prayer, being nourished by the scriptures, Therese discovered God who is mercy. And this is something which is not to be taken lightly, because I think we can actually see from some of the practices that the nuns were doing at that time, such as the wearing of that cross made of iron, the little penances that they make, by wearing a habit which is of rough cloth, the lack of central heating, the lack of even the types of food that they take. Sometimes there was a current of spirituality that was going through the Carmel and the Catholic Church at that time that emphasized a lot on God, who is not so much merciful, but God who is a judge. So many times, some of these nuns, they would offer their discomfort and the suffering that they are experiencing as a means to placate God from the sinfulness of humanity. They think that by enduring with all of these sufferings, somehow or another, God would accept their sacrifice and say that, okay, I will not destroy humanity because I have these group of nuns who are, sacrificing for me. In fact, this is a distortion of the Gospels. In fact, it is a distortion of our teaching, the teachings of Christ, because we have to remember, if you want to talk about who God actually is, we go back to the Gospels, and what sort of picture of God do we find there? We find a picture of God who is merciful, a God who is love, a God who, desires to reconcile men and women who are sinners back to Him. Think about the prodigal son. You think about the woman who seeks out for the coin, the lost coin. You think about the person who goes after and looks after and to find the sheep that is lost. This is a portrait that is found in the scriptures, God who is mercy. And therefore, for Therese herself, because she was so steeped in scripture, this was a picture of God that was very striking to her. But at that time when Therese was around, these were not the image that we will understand of God. Instead, we will find pictures of God who was angry, God who was just waiting to punish, God who was very upset with his people because they have turned away from Him, so on and so forth. So Therese, from her reading of scripture, found an image of God which was very much different from what was the image of God that others had at that time. So, of course, this is an image of God from the Gospels, and it's a God who radiates love and mercy. But unfortunately, at the time of Therese, it was obscured by the image of God who is a judge, a God who is justice. And this God of mercy is a God who desires to give Himself, freely. In Christ and His humanity, God poured forth His divinity. He took on human flesh in order to redeem us. In Mary, she received the fullness of grace, preserving her from sin. So in baptism as well, we are cleansed from our sin, we are reconciled, and we are brought into communion with Him. So all of these images today, after Vatican II and after much study of the Bible, we have come to rediscover this. But in the days of Therese, this was something which was not so apparent, actually. And since God is a merciful Father, He delights in loving us. So for Therese, God is like a father, He's like a mother, a loving parent who, in order to be happy, must have his child upon his knee. He desires the company of his children. And responding to this desire of God to love us, the least we can do is just to be with Him, fixing our gaze on Him. So this, in fact, also conditions how Therese would approach prayer itself. Prayer doesn't mean I have to do a lot of things, I have to say many chaplets, or I have to say many rosaries. No. What is important is just to be with the Lord at that time. The simplicity of Therese's prayer is even the mere thought of God itself is already constitutes for Therese prayer itself. So it is very much like a being with God. There is no need to think up or complicate matters by thinking about formulas in order to come to God. So Therese's relationship with God is via a love that gives, and it is God who just desires to give. He just loves, full stop. But if we think about God as a judge, then we think about Him is like this. If I don't do this thing for God, God does not love me. So therefore, I must do certain X, Y, Z things so that only then God will love me. So for Therese, there is no need for that. In fact, as you are, whatever state you are in, just go to Him with trust. Trust in His love, trust in His mercy. Don't have to bargain with God. So Therese is just content to remain in His presence and understanding and appreciating this love that God has for her. Her life is just like a perpetual thanksgiving, a perpetual living in the presence of God. So in everything that she does, She compares it to just the act of strewing flowers. You think about, like, sometimes you have processions of like, Corpus Christi, or maybe a procession of a saint or something like that. Sometimes people along the streets, when they find a procession going past, they will throw flowers. Per se, the flowers itself, they mean nothing. God does not need those flowers. But it is something that comes from the heart. It is our way of expressing our love for him. So likewise, for Therese, the things that she does, even the ordinary things that she's doing in the community, be it to be charitable to a nun who is grumpy, or to clean the floors, or to prepare something for the sacristy, everything she does it with great attention, because it is her way of offering it to the Lord, not to make God love her anymore, but it's just coming deep down from a sense of love, of being loved. There is no need to bargain with God. You just live, in love, basically. So this spirituality of Therese has been given the name. She herself calls it a little way. So this is actually, it is really much, the foundation of that is essentially God, who is full of love and mercy. So she calls it a little way because it is meant to be a way that is simple, lived out in everyday life. So daily life itself is the platform of our encounter with the Lord. And so in fact, it's taken also from the Gospels itself. Unless you become like little children, you will never enter the kingdom of God. So this little way is practiced by the child of God. And this is indeed who we are. We're all his beloved children. And as his children, of course, we are aware, to be childlike as well, is to be aware of our littleness before God. The fact that we are not giants before God. It is to accept ourselves, to look at us with humility, and just desiring to be loved by the Lord. All right. And this is a way that brings us to direct contact with God, because it is lived out in constant habitual awareness of our need for God at all times, because we are little, because we know without God we can't really do a lot. We need his strength, we need his presence. He needs to strengthen us even when we want to practice virtue. And it's really this dependence on God, this total dependence on the Lord. And Therese, seeing this God who desires to just give himself to us, she embraces that. She doesn't set conditions to God. She lives by the conditions that God has set up. And that condition is just to be little. It's just to be humble before the Lord. So in a way, she would say that this little way is the way of spiritual childhood. It is the way of confidence and total abandonment. It is to recognize our nothingness, to expect everything from God, as the little child expects everything from its father. It is to be disquieted about nothing, and not to be set on gaining our living. Even among the poor, they give the child what is necessary, but as soon as he grows up, his father no longer wants to feed him and says, "Work now, you can take care of yourself." So this is something which is rather interesting, because how do we relate to God often? We think that in order to relate to God, or in order to be pleasing to him, we have to be somebody in order to be liked or to be acceptable to God. But in fact, that goes contrary to what the Lord wants to achieve in us. Because if we want to do things on our own and to be all grown up, to be so to speak, then God will respect our decision to do so, and he will not intervene. He will, he'll say, "Okay, you want to do things without me? Fine, I will let you do it." But on the other hand, if we come to him and we depend ourselves totally upon him, and we seek his strength at all moments, we seek his virtues at all moments, we basically ask him to really to take the lead, essentially. So there is no need, then God really is working through us. And this is something that Therese discovered. So she was never, it doesn't mean that she doesn't do anything. She does, she tries to be patient, she tries to be kind, she tries to do everything to the best of her abilities. But at the times when she feels that she has failed to do it, she does not become too upset. She would just say, "I know that I this is who I am. It is I accept my littleness." But it's just that reliance on God. It's just like, if you want to do anything, where do we start first? Do we start by asking God for the graces that we need first and foremost? Do we first and foremost look towards him and say, "Lord, please inspire me to do this. Lord, please give me strength in order to do this"? Or do we try to be Superman or Superwoman and we try to do things on our own, trying to put God out of the picture? So here, in Therese's case, that was never the case at all. She would always turn to God first and ask for the help that she needed. And she would do it. And whatever the result it was, she would accept it gratefully, and she would not be upset whether the thing was done to perfection, or the thing was somewhat not so perfect. She was humble. She knows that she's limited, she's little, and of course everything else, it goes back to God. It was so as not to hear this that I never wanted to grow up, feeling that I was incapable of making my living the eternal life of heaven. I've always remained little, therefore, having no other occupation but to gather flowers, the flowers of love and sacrifice, and of offering them to God in order to please Him. So therefore, it is just that, it's just a life lived out in gratitude for whatever blessings, for the love that God is showering upon us. And all these things that we do is just like strewing flowers. That is all. To be little is not attributing to oneself the virtues that one practices, but leaving oneself capable of anything, but to recognize that God places this treasure in the hands of His little child to be used when necessary, but it remains always God's treasure. Finally, it is not to become discouraged over one's faults, for children fall often, but they are too little to hurt themselves very much. So characteristics of the little way. First and foremost is littleness and humility, recognizing our weakness, powerlessness, and inadequacy, acknowledging our total dependence on God, the fact that we need His help to accomplish anything and everything. And to acknowledge our littleness is therefore to obtain God's powerful help. Okay. Who's this? Okay, just got to mute some people. The other thing is, of course, poverty leads us to recognize that we owe nothing, expect everything from God. I am very poor. It is the good Lord who provides me from moment to moment with the amount of help I need to practice virtue. So Therese happily acknowledges her poverty because it is no obstacle to loving and serving God. Confidence in God. We are bold enough to trust in God. We are bold enough to approach Him, to seek His help on our journey to Him. We have this trust and abandonment in God's mercy. And this is what she actually says, almost the last lines of the story of the soul, she actually says this: even though I had on my conscience all the sins that can be committed, I would go, my heart broken with sorrow, and throw myself into Jesus' arms, for I know how much He loves the prodigal child who returns to Him. So confidence and trust in God. So there is nothing that we can possibly do that would prevent God from loving us and receiving us back into a relationship with Him. So this confidence in God is something that is really fundamental to Therese's little way. And so she actually says this in a letter that she writes to her sister Leonie. I assure you that God is much better than you believe. He is content with a glance, a sigh of love. As for me, I find perfection very easy to practice because I have understood it is a matter of taking hold of Jesus by His heart. Look at the little child who has just annoyed his mother by flying into a temper or by disobeying her. If he hides away in a corner in a sulky mood, and if he cries in fear of being punished, his mama will not pardon him, certainly not his fault. But if he comes to her holding out his little arms, smiling and saying, "Kiss me, I will not do it again," will his mother not be able to press him to her heart tenderly and forget his childish mischief? However, she knows her dear little one will do it again on the next occasion. But this does not matter. If he takes her again by her heart, he will not be punished. So such is the confidence that Therese has in the forgiveness, in the mercy of God. So not to feel that we have to fear the Lord, not to say we have to be afraid of Him, but to, as we are, we go to Him. As we are, we approach Him. As we are, we ask Him for forgiveness. We ask Him for mercy. And God is more than happy to receive us again and to bring us back into back to reconciliation with Him. So we are therefore invited to have confidence that God is easily pleased with our tokens of love, the very desire for us to go to Him. We can behave towards Him like a child who is confident of its mother's love, recognizing that nothing the child could possibly do will ever lead the mother to abandon it. Likewise, nothing we do can ever make us to be forsaken by the Lord. And in fact, oftentimes it is more that we do not trust God enough. We feel that He is not forgiving enough, that we feel that we are undeserving, we cannot approach the Lord. And that is, in a way, we are cutting ourselves off from the mercy that God wants to bestow upon us. It's in coming back to that letter there, it's almost as though the mother is hostage to her child. It only has to turn to its mother with loving sorrow, and she's rendered powerless, won over by love for her child. So this expression, take Jesus by the heart, is what Therese used to say of what does it mean to be little and poor, to be confident in God's merciful love. This trust and abandonment of ourselves to God, especially on our journey towards Him. So this little way, in fact, is Therese's highway to holiness, because Therese actually had great desires to become a saint. But the model of how it was presented to Therese as to what it means to become a saint was exactly what Dorothy Day would have read in all the other saints, that they had needed to be martyred, they needed to renounce all their property and, to go to the desert and live for the Lord, or maybe they needed to undertake some great mission to go to some place and convert the natives and things like that. But Therese was not capable of doing any of these sort of things. And so she nevertheless felt deep within her this desire that she wanted to become a saint. And this path that she has discovered, this little way, is the way in which Therese believed was what God had given to her to say that it is by this way that you become a saint. And Therese was also convinced that this is the way that God calls not just her, but many other people as well. Many other people who feel that they are not capable of those great deeds, of those great works of other saints. People like her who were simple, people like her who were, vulnerable. So for her, this little way is the way for people to become saints. So therefore, this was her straight shot. This was her new way, because she cannot travel that conventional way of the great saints. So she cannot become a saint by her own efforts. So she becomes increasingly little, to the point where Jesus himself will be the person, will be the one who carries her to himself. So it is really an abandonment to Jesus to then tell Jesus, since you, Lord, want me to become a saint, you will make me a saint. You were the one who will carry me to yourself. And in fact, she will write in one of her last conversations, she will actually say this: sanctity does not consist of this or that practice. It consists of disposition of heart, which makes us humble and little in the arms of God, conscious of our weakness, and confident to the point of audacity in the goodness of our Father. So holiness therefore depends on our relationship with God and how it continues to grow, and knowing also our littleness and our need of His mercy. So really, it's almost as though we come to God and we ask God to carry us to Himself. And of course, since He is holy, by coming close to Him, we become holy as well, we become saints. So this leads to an authentic abandonment of ourselves to God, and we respond willingly to His merciful love. So coming back again to asceticism and holiness, this is something that, of course, we've touched upon already. And then, of course, how this contrasts with what was going on in Therese's time. Nuns were expected to perform all kinds of mortification, that's what we mentioned before. And it is thought, especially in those days, that by doing all of these things, that one becomes holy, one becomes a saint. But Therese was never drawn to all of these things. Rather, her asceticism is lived out in the day-to-day occurrences that are taking place, in her life. So her asceticism, her purification, if you want to call it that way, or her sacrifices, took the form of carrying out her ordinary duties. So instead of spending all this time, in suffering because you're wearing this heavy iron cross, or because of the cold and the heat, the cold that you had to endure, the unbearable heat. So for her, the mortifications were directed to her responsibilities, performing them with sincerity and perfection. So that means that whatever that she was asked to do, whatever duties that she had to do in the community, her entire attention was directed to that. And she tried to do it to the best of her ability. And not only that, all of these things were done as an offering to the Lord. So whatever that happened, that it could be shaking the blanket, sweeping the stairs, or even the apostolate here, in terms of course, she did not leave the monastery, but this is in terms of the formation that she was giving to the young novices, how she actually prepared herself, how did she actually even educate or form these little ones, these young nuns. And I think in that also, it is a good example of this ability, how it is being lived out, this little way, is how she actually formed the nuns. Because Therese was a very young nun herself, and she felt that she did not possess the experience necessary in order to instruct these nuns, what does it mean to be a Carmelite? What does it mean to be a good sister in the community? In fact, today, someone of her age would never ever be considered an assistant to the novice mistress. It would be unheard of because obviously you lack the experience and you lack the knowledge. But in Therese's time, she was given this. And how did she actually do it? Well, in a way, as she has always advocated, she put her trust in the Lord. So she, in fact, before she began her very apostolate to form these nuns, she spent time in prayer. She put her trust in the Lord. She said, Lord, these are the nuns that you have given to me. These are the nuns you have called to this Carmel. So since you have put me in this position to be a formator for them, so you furnish me, you inspire me, you help me. How do I fulfill this responsibility? And after that, once she has put her trust in the Lord, that's it. She continued. She accepted that responsibility. She tried to do it to the best of her ability. And in fact, looking back, she actually realized that many times the Lord inspired her in order to accomplish some of the duties that she had to take place. And to her surprise, oftentimes without without expertise, so to speak, she was not trained as a formator, but somehow she was able to actually impact the novices, to teach them what it means to be holy, what it means to live in community, what does it mean to be charitable in the community, so on and so forth. And of course, this was a fidelity that was, this faithfulness to ordinary duties is also very much tied down to the vow of obedience that religious make. And so the way her acceptance of this responsibility to be the assistant novice mistress was an exercise of obedience, because it was the superior, the mother prioress herself, who wanted her in that office, even though the rest knew that she was inadequate for that. But she, trusted that, since God is working through her mother prioress, so she humbly accepts that responsibility and she'll try it to the best of her ability, of course, with the help of God. The other aspect of the sacrifice or the asceticism is the charity that she lived. And this has been mentioned, she lived in a community of 20-something nuns, different age, temperament, background, plenty of occasions of friction, misunderstandings, and conflict. But of course, she distinguished herself in the community by her practice of charity, by the cheerfulness that she radiated in that community, especially towards sisters who were the most disagreeable. So I've mentioned already an elderly nun who she brought to the refectory daily. The other one was a nun who, during the times of prayer, would often distract her because she would constantly be, to do something with her teeth that Therese, as she's trying to concentrate in prayer, she would find it so distracting and so annoying. But Therese, eventually she came to a point where she said, okay, Lord, since I can't do anything about this, I will just accept this noise as your heavenly orchestra. And then she somehow found peace with that resignation. Another one is the melancholic nun. This is a nun who was suffering perhaps from some depression, or she was someone who was very difficult to live with. And so this particular nun was very sensitive. And one particular day, one evening, Therese realized that this nun was going through a very, very difficult time. Probably something happened, and this nun was very sad. And as this nun was making her way back to her room, doing so, she would actually need to pass through Therese's room itself. So Therese made this extra effort. She knows that the nun will walk past her. She purposely waited at the door, the entrance to her room. And as this nun, who was very sad, was walking nearby, Therese purposefully made herself known, and she gave her a smile. She just smiled at this nun. And it might seem like something totally insignificant, but for this nun, it was something that made a lot of difference, because probably at that moment when Therese smiled at her, she felt she was loved. She felt she was appreciated. She felt, whatever it is that happened before, where she felt really lousy about herself, that moment, all those thoughts disappeared. So it's just a small gesture that she made. Therese would have waited for her there, probably wondering whether this nun is coming up. And she waited patiently for this sad nun to walk past, and she just gave that smile. And for this nun, it was something that stood out for the rest of her life. The splashing of dirty water, this is another incident that took place. The nuns, of course, they had to do laundry together. And what happened here was this there was, in the pub, the area where they were washing the horse, everything was done by hand. While opposite her, there was another sister who was probably scrubbing maybe some stains which were very tough to come out. So she was really making a record, and the water, she was just splashing, all the dirty water was splashing over Therese. So Therese was, of course, really, really angry because she felt really offended and a bit humiliated that all this dirty water was splashing onto her. But just at the point where she wanted to frown at her and to glare at this other nun, she somehow had the presence of mind to restrain herself, and she just accepted all those dirty water splashing upon her as a kind of showers of blessing from the Lord, just a way of just turning around. Instead of being an occasion to infuriate her, it became an occasion maybe of joy even, yes. And of course, Therese's presence during community recreation, this one I had mentioned before, how she would constantly cheer up the nuns when they come together. She would make jokes. She would impersonate sometimes even the fathers who were celebrating Mass and all that. She would impersonate them just to make them laugh. And of course, her charitable presence, even with those whom other members of the community had difficulty relating with. And of course, all of this was lived up also right to the point when her faith was really tested. Therese, in fact, she was someone who died at the age of 24. So she entered the age of 15. She died at the age of 24. She only stayed 9 years in this convent. And at the end of her short life, in fact, she experienced a tremendous trial of faith. So, in fact, towards the end of her life, there were times where she was enveloped with a great doubt, with a great sense that there is no God. So if in the beginning Therese was filled with a lot of with a sense of God's nearness and of God's love, at a point where she actually developed tuberculosis, to the point where she died, a period of about maybe a year or year and a half, she really felt abandoned. Some have studied her life. They say that it was a point where Therese was going through a dark night, actually, a dark night of the soul, whereby it was a period of purification. And she somehow felt no sense of God. But at the time, she really felt at times she had to be very careful of what she said, because she was afraid she would blaspheme. And so at this time, how she lived out her this trial of faith was really just to believe in the goodness of God. Even though she did not feel it, and if every thought in her mind seems to indicate otherwise, she just had to be convinced. She held very firmly to her faith. And one of the expressions that she made that showed the degree of the suffering that she was going through was that she actually wrote the creed in her own blood. That was the sign that she said, I die, so I will believe in God who loves me, and God who is merciful. Die, I will do that. That was a kind of trial that she was going through. So therefore, writing the creed in her own blood. And it was really, of course, not only in hindsight we see that there was grace involved, because even though she did not feel God's presence, but nevertheless, that grace was being given to her to persevere right to the very end. And in fact, at the moment of her death, if before she was going through this trial of faith, somehow at the moment of death, the sisters who were with her, they noticed that her face actually changed from a face that was just full of pain and sadness. It suddenly became peaceful, and it was as though her eyes was looking to some far off point, and her last words were simply, "Jesus, I love you. Jesus, I love you." So it's almost as though at the end of her life, that veil that had covered her after her point of illness, it was just removed, and perhaps she had a vision of God, and that was the thing that she died in the peace of the Lord, basically. So we've covered quite a fair bit what the little way is, and how it is a path of trust and abandonment to God, how it is lived out also in the everyday context of day-to-day living. In fact, we do not need to do something extraordinary. The ordinary circumstances provide us with a place of encounter with the Lord. And so for Dorothy Day, when she read Therese the first time, she wasn't really impressed by it at all. But over time, as her Catholic worker movement grew, and as she became more involved day to day with all the activities and all the happenings that were taking place in this movement, she began to see the value of the little way, and how every small thing done whatever humble task asked of us, if it is done with fidelity, if it is done with graciousness, if it is done with the awareness that God is loving us, that, he is sustaining us with his mercy and his goodness, these little moments can be transformative. So the little way shows that no act, however insignificant, is without meaning when done within the awareness of God's loving presence. Then it can be whatever situation. It can be a mother with child, can be a parent at work, it can be a store clerk, a scholar, a nursing home worker. Every person in the ordinary and required activity of daily life has this little way to holiness, to love as God loves us. So for Dorothy Day, therefore, there is this way to holiness. The little way is a path to holiness open to everybody. Everybody can be saved following the way of Therese. But we may ask the question, why is it so important? Why was Dorothy Day so caught up with the little way? Why is it so important that all of us become saints? Because for Dorothy Day, being as she is someone who is seeking to transform the world, trying to make the world a better place, trying to make a world which is more fair, more just, where people are embraced regardless of the differences. For Dorothy Day, all of these things can only take place when we, each person who is involved in this struggle, who is involved in life, actually become saints. And it's only through saints that the world can be saved and transformed. So in fact, in her notebook, and this is in 1951, so many years after she had read the story of her soul, she actually wrote these words, Dorothy Day: "Sanctity alone will meet the crisis of the day. Nothing else matters. One can feed the poor, shelter the homeless, comfort the afflicted, but if you have not charity, the love of God, sanctity, it is worthless." In other words, the work of social transformation requires saints. And therefore, in fact, for Dorothy Day, Therese became almost like the saint, her most cherished saint of all. So, of course, in the younger days, she rejected Therese, or she found her very insignificant, unimportant. But the day-to-day experience of her with the Catholic worker movement, with these houses of hospitality, running shelters, constant routine of serving meals, baking beds, cleaning, conversing with the destitute and the outcast, all of these things began to take on a different meaning for her when she tried to implement the little way in all of these events. So all of these things, even the writings, the newspapers, speaking in her country, praying, fasting, protesting, everything, she always had the awareness of Therese's little way in the back of her mind. And in fact, Therese, at the point of her death, she foresaw that this spirituality of hers will take the world by storm. It will be something that is very important. And she could actually raise up a legion of little souls, would follow her way towards knowing and loving God and radiating his love towards others. So Dorothy Day was definitely one of these little souls. But of course, she lived out the little way in a context which was not restricted by the walls of the cloister. But she, it was lived out very much in the arena of, fighting for social justice, in serving the poor, and really challenging the status quo or the prejudices that were existing at that time. So for both Martha and Mary, for both Dorothy and Therese, both of them show us the power of the love of God in the work of social and human transformation. So in fact, of course, we might see and even question, is it really possible that, the life that is lived out in a Carmelite convent, can it be applied to a life of someone who is, traveling across the United States, in marching, in protesting and all that, So Dorothy Day herself is aware of that difference, but this is what she says. So I am not trying to say that the little flower would have gone out on picket lines and spoken on communist platforms or embraced Protestant neighbors if there were any in the town of Alençon. Alençon was a town where Therese was born. So Therese, she was a product of her environment, bourgeois, middle class, daughter of skilled workers, comfortable, frugal people who lived apart from the world with their eyes on God, and yet were very much a part of the world at that time. She wanted everything, every apostolate, she said, both when she was a child and later as a young woman. And she used the means at her disposal to participate in everything, to increase the sum total of the love of God in the world by every minute act, every suffering, every movement of her body and soul, done for the love of God and the love of souls. She used the spiritual weapons every one of us has at our disposal. So this is very important, to increase the sum total of the love of God in the world by every minute act, every suffering, every act done with the love of God, every act done to increase, to just bring that love of God in every possible circumstance. And so here, Dorothy Day comes to the conclusion of the power of being little. So for Dorothy Day, Therese's little way was powerful in spite of its apparent simplicity. And she likened it to a dynamite that will blow the Catholic Church. So Dorothy Day says, she, Therese, speaks to our condition. Is an atom a small thing? And yet what havoc it has wrought. In her little way, is her little way a small contribution to the life of the Spirit? It has all the power of the Spirit of Christianity behind it. So just as an atom, that small thing, if you make it into a bomb, it can be extremely destructive. Yet likewise, the little way is something that can be like dynamite. And because it has all the power of the Spirit of Christianity, because it is based very much on the gospel itself. Christ came to reveal to us God who is love, and God who wants to love us, and just to allow that love to flow through us, to flow to all those around us. So Dorothy continues, at a time when there are such grave fears because of the radioactive particles that are sprinkled over the world by the hydrogen bomb test, and the question is asked, what effect are they going to have on the physical life of the universe? One can state that this saint of this day is releasing a force, a spiritual force upon the world to counteract that fear and that disaster. We know that one impulse of grace is of infinitely more power than a cobalt bomb. Think about that. The little way is more powerful than an atomic bomb. So therefore, it's coming to terms also with this call that we are asked to be salt and light as well. I do not know, but at least here in Kuala Lumpur, there's been this constant recurring theme, especially in many of our talks and many of our sessions in our parishes today, this constant reminder that we are called to be salt and light. Very much part of this whole emphasis on the synodal way that is taking place in our dioceses, in our church, in fact, the whole church actually. And when you speak about salt and light, what kind of flavor, what kind of light are we showing? And for Therese and Dorothy, it is really, the salt and light is really the love of God. The love of God that we know we are possessed by, and the love of God by which we are also called to radiate towards others. And of course, this love is the Spirit Himself working in us, transforming us, molding us, helping us to come to the full realization of the gospel itself. And the more we live it out, the more we try to bring this love to our life situations, our homes, our families, our workplaces. That is the thing that makes us different. That is the thing that sets us apart. That is why we are salt and light. That's why we have this flavor. But it's the flavor of the love of God. So that's that.